Hello and welcome to the dark side. We are so glad that you join us each week for our updates on topical, historical, racial education, and a slice of discussion where we talk about the things that matter. We try and unpack it, giving you some historical facts, some educational information, while of course keeping it 100% real and letting you know how we feel about certain topics and sharing our ideas with you. In that way, we ask, as always, that you share your topics, your responses, your ideas with us, and we love to have that interaction. So please add your stuff in the comments section, and then of course we can see it. If you are using Facebook and not our YouTube channel, what we would ask is that you let Facebook have permission or StreamYard have permission through Facebook so that we can see your name when we're responding. So welcome to the dark side. I am your host, Pastor Tabitha Purple, and TC Storm will be joining us shortly. Today's topic that we will be unpacking is Black representation in media. And we're going to be really kind of giving it a whole look at from different angles, asking questions, maybe not necessarily even answering the questions ourselves, but really dissecting and discussing some of the questions surrounding how Black people are represented in media. How does that intersectionality of gender and Blackness actually work on screen? How does colorism play a part? And all of those difficult questions. So hang on to your seats, folks. We're going to be in for a good ride. But today we're going to start in our usual fashion with our 3 news stories. And the first story that I wanted to bring to you today is about the country of Mali, and it's about the French. And what it's saying is that there is a news story that hit this week that the French are going to be withdrawing their 5,000 troops from Mali. Now, the Mali people are very happy about this in some regards, but the question has to remain, why were they there in the first place? Well, in fact, in 2013, France sent around 5,000 troops to Mali, and they were actually requested, apparently, because by the government at the time, because they were facing a lot of rebellion and some armed issues that were happening in the region. And so this happened around the time that Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, was taken out, and so a lot of the fighters were returning home, and in that case, it was stirring up problems within other countries, according to the reports. Now, I don't want to get too much into that. The reality of what I want to talk about is actually, why have the French presence been so disruptive? What is it about the French in Mali that has been such a source of disruption? And this I found really interesting. It says that the number of terror attacks since they've been in the country has steadily increased. So they're there to stop the terror. And in fact, what's been happening is the terror has actually been increasing under their help. It's been actually making the region more unstable and causing more problems. The people then feel that if you are not helping and you have no solutions, go home, is in effect what it is. And of course, you'll remember in earlier episodes, the French notoriously have made awful remarks about the people of Mali. 55 French troops were killed, and their response was they demanded the president come and explain himself, instead of actually accepting that the Mali people have been the ones who have been suffering the most, and it's been hundreds to thousands of them that have died, and you're 55, while sad that you are losing people. Of course, death is never something to rejoice over. Demanding the president come and explain himself when you're supposed to be there helping the president is crazy. Okay, so any thoughts on this topic? Obviously, colonial powers have difficult relationships to navigate, since they don't really accept responsibility for the damage that they've caused in their countries that they've been into. They often are still having ties that are very treacherous and still confusing. They don't respect the people that are there. And if you can't respect the people that are there to have intelligence and to be an equal, then you're always going to run into these difficult situations where you're trying to apparently restore the peace, but you're not actually doing the job.
Is anyone really surprised that acts of terrorism have increased since the French went into the country?
No.
Here's the reality of it. The attacks have probably increased because it's been easier for terrorists to get weapons. Because who are you getting them from? The French. It's like when countries declare we want a war on terrorism. You know that most of the weapons these people are using have written on them made in England or made in the US or made wherever,
Yep,
right?
indeed.
And
Indeed.
so you're not really trying to stop any war if you're supplying the weapons to the opposition,
Indeed.
right? So I'm not surprised by this. Kick the French out, send them home.
Well, indeed, they are leaving, and I think it's an important part to play. But I think what's interesting, and one of our users here, one of our viewers here has asked the question, why can't these African people help themselves? I think what's really interesting is if you go into a country and you decimate them and you destroy the systems of power that exist, you take away the authority that the people have to govern themselves, you're constantly disrupting their leaders, you put them under heavy burdens of debt, and then can turn around and say, well, why can't you just do it yourself after hundreds and hundreds of years of colonial power rule, and then still to this day heavy burdens of debt because those colonial powers fine you effectively for not producing money for them anymore, so they find another way of taxing you. And we've talked about this before. Unfortunately, you get into situations like this where a colonial power thinks they can step into a country that there was a former colony and help, but the help that they're offering comes at a price, and the people themselves are paying that price. So the people have said, well, it's okay, we'll just sort it out ourselves, please go home, and are sending them back where they came from and said, this needs to end, or we cannot continue to deal with you because actually things are escalating, not de-escalating, and you were asked to help to de-escalate the problem. But in fact, what is happening is you are escalating the problem. And so I think it's easy to be dismissive, but if you don't treat the people there with the respect that they deserve, that they can actually govern themselves, and we're doing that long before you came, I think it's really just very problematic.
Listen, to be honest, I think this person is just a troll, to be honest. Because I'm watching what they're putting up. South Africa was under colonization. Why are they now a self-sufficient country? What's the other's excuse? Have you seen the reporting on South Africa? No? Okay. Not to mention that there are historical and global political reasons for the difference between South Africa and a lot of the other countries. Let's take Zimbabwe, for example. Shall we talk about the crippling economic sanctions placed upon them when they tried to go independent, when they tried to assert their sovereignty, right? Yeah. So look, this person is clearly a troll, because I mean, like the first comment, hey Tabitha, you don't look black. What's that got to do with anything?
Indeed. Well, let's move on to our second story then. Our second story, as you know, we like to cover stories that span the European and also the African continents and Asia, and we like to try and concentrate our work outside of the USA sometimes, and this week we're going to continue that. We're looking at the sex abuse scandals that are now coming out of, well, now, that's not quite true, historically have come out of Italy and the Catholic Church. And there has been a recent move to change the law there to stop there being the statute of limitations has been prohibiting priests from getting prosecuted, despite the fact that some of them have been charged within the cardinal system, convicted within that system, found guilty within that system, but are still serving as priests. And so the BBC has done an investigation into the true scale of the clerical sex abuse scandals in Italy. And what it says is that basically there are so many stories of where the abuse has just never been confronted, never been dealt with properly, despite the fact that they're having the trials, despite the fact that the Vatican, of course, sits within an odd space within Italy, despite all of these relationships, they still haven't managed to deal with the scale of the problem. And in this particular article, they concentrate on the story of a guy called Mario, and it's Father Giano Beccalaris, I think. Forgive me if I pronounce that incorrectly. And basically, Mario tells it's horrific. I mean, any story of abuse is always startling, I think, and jarring to the human. But when you read his story, it is horrific how this priest behaved. And he was found guilty in canon. So he paid 112,000. I had to ask how a priest had 112,000. 112.
Come on, you know the answer to that.
Like the majority of people who work within the religious sector, myself included, we're like on basic wages. When these people got 112,000, I was like, oh, that was a lot of money. I like had to gulp real breath when I saw that number. I was like, oh, that's a lot.
You need a new employer.
I'm telling you, I was just like, hold on. How have you managed to save that? Clearly, he's not married with children. Just saying. There's a few issues there, but regardless, he had to pay 112,000 euro fine for admitting to the crime. So even though he feels like the nuance of the situation is different, he still agreed that he committed this crime against this child, and who is now an adult. And the abuse was such that he sent pictures to the family, to this child's parents, of the places they had visited together so that the parents could hang them on the wall. And these were the places where he had raped the child. So every time the child was at home, this man was just terrorizing him in his house. It's just like, it's awful. But under the legal system, when Mario realized that this priest was not going to be defrocked, he was not going to be sacked, he wanted to file criminal charges then, because he went through the system that is within the church and it didn't work. And so he wanted to file criminal charges. But the entire legal system in Italy is having to be reworked because the statute of limitations had passed for an act of this nature against a child. And therefore, because of the way they count the time, they don't count the time from the time you report. They count the time, of course, from the time the action had the first incident had happened. Not the last incident, but the first incident had happened. And therefore, the time had elapsed. And statute of limitations is very short for these sorts of crimes. We can talk about that in another day. But basically, the Vatican itself, the Pope Francis has really been trying to make changes, according to the report. He has basically outlawed the code of silence called the pontifical secrecy, and has basically banned that can now no longer exist. And he's instituted the bishops at the bishops' conference, the first national day of prayer for the survivors of abuse. He's done things, but this will be my point. And this is the point that I really find quite disturbing. If you do not remove abusers from their position of power, you have done nothing. I mean, removing the secrecy, wonderful, applaud you, lovely. I mean, that's great, because of course that shouldn't exist in the first place. But you're not removing the people from their position who are abusers. So they continue to have the power to abuse. I mean, this is just like, to me, seems like really logical common sense. Anyway, over to you.
Look, listen, I'll tell you exactly where they got the money from. Yeah, when people be dropping the offering in, it's 1 for you, 2 for me, 1 for you, 2 for me. Right? Look, let's just be real. That's where the money came from. In terms of this whole scenario, I disagree with there being a statute of limitations on crimes such as this. The USA, certain states have the same problem as well, where they have a statute of limitation on rape and sexual abuse. Some have now started to do away with it, but it still remains in most of the states there. The reason being I disagree with the statute of limitations is because there's no statute of limitations of murder. And we may have discussed this before, but part of the reason for that is I can't remember what the legal term for it is that murder is so heinous that you should inherently know that it is wrong. Well, here's the thing. Rape is so heinous, you should inherently know that it is wrong. Therefore, there should be no statute of limitations on it. The problem is that rape has historically occurred where the perpetrators have been powerful and the victims have been powerless.
Yeah.
And so there has been no real push to deal with this issue. And that's partly why the statute of limitations still exists in many cases.
Yeah.
So it needs to go. And finally, I agree with you that if you're not going to at least remove the priest, then you haven't done anything.
Right.
And here's the thing, the Vatican is its own, state. Listen, here's the deal. Invite the dirty bungle to come see you and then throw him in a dungeon. Simple as. We know you have done
you mentioned that. So interesting you mentioned that. The news story actually goes on to say that the church has been running rehabilitation centers. And so for these rehabilitation centers, they normally it's for priests with what they say small minor problems in which they need to get rehab, so alcohol abuse or maybe gambling or something like that. The other thing that they've been doing, though, is putting all of the ones that have been found guilty in canon law into those rehabilitation centers. So funny you mentioned that, because they're starting to bring those in, and questionable what's going on behind those closed doors, but nevertheless, that is something that is occurring.
Yeah. So
alrighty. So would you like the final story?
Yep, go with it.
Okay, I have good news. I don't normally have a good news story to share, but I have a good news story to share. Something that we looked at before that I wanted to bring up, and it is to do with sickle cell. Now, we spoke about this before. You've mentioned that there was some new revolutionary gene editing treatment that gave sickle cell patients new life, but this now has actually become part of a 45 patient study, and it's been done on those with sickle cell or beta thalassemia. Ooh, this is always confusing. This is always going to be a bit much. So we're doing the science, but basically, if you don't know what sickle cell is, it's a disease that runs in the family. It's caused by a genetic mutation that leads to the body making abnormal hemoglobin. This is a protein that's packed into the red blood cells that carries oxygen around the body. Red blood cells are normally round and squishy, but mutated hemoglobin can make them rigid and take on the characteristics of a sickle shape, thus making it incredibly painful as they travel through your body. It actually is cripplingly painful, because instead of being squishy and able to flow through your veins easily and without pain, the hard nature makes it almost impossible for this to occur. And so they sickle cell sufferers have something called crises, where they're in so much pain they often have to be admitted into hospital. And what they're seeing is basically, with the introduction of this new gene therapy, it sounded excruciatingly painful. What they do is they drain all of the, or they try and drain all of the marrow producing ports that actually stimulate the development of hemoglobin out of your body, and then replace it with a blood transfusion, and then replace the producing cells. It's very confusing for me, who's not a scientist. Producing cells with good producing, so gene therapy, and they try and revert you to the state you were in your womb. It's a very interesting article. Please go do the research for yourself. But this to say, the reason this is a good news story, and the reason I wanted to bring this, is because sickle cell predominantly affects people within the Black community, people from African heritage. And therefore, there has been, up until recent years, no real incentive to help those people. And I know many friends, myself, many people that we know who suffer with sickle cell or who carry the sickle cell trait. It is debilitating, but it is also life-ending. The mortality rate for children on the African continent who carry the sickle cell is extraordinarily high. The mortality rate for people who live in so-called Western countries, they make it out of childhood, but they tend to die earlier from other complications due to the disease. This is life-changing because up until now, many people hadn't even heard of sickle cell, let alone the amount of research and money that needs to go into finding a way of treating it effectively that will help people. So these 45 people who've had their lives completely turned around and are now living pain-free lives at the moment and seem to have no other side effects from the sickle cell it's just amazing. It's like the best news that can be delivered. So I thought I'd share with you some good news that affects the Black community in a way that's really positive and is very life transforming.
Okay. I thought you were actually going to talk about the AIDS one.
Ah, yes. Yeah, that's true. Yes, that was the one we weren't discussing sickle cell. No, it wasn't you. Someone else I was discussing that with. Okay. All right. Well, you mentioned the AIDS one then, because I didn't. I was very hyped on the sickle cell one today.
No, we can do it next time.
Okay. We'll do it next time. Sounds good. All right. So that's our news stories for today. We are going to look at now our main story, which is going to look at the intersectionality of media and Black representation. And so for those of you that follow any kind of sports or are alive in the media world, you will have seen that the Super Bowl halftime show received, it feels like, critical acclaim around the world. Like everybody was really blown away with the performances of Dr. Dre, Snoop, Eminem, Mary J. Blige, 50 Cent, and Kendrick Lamar. It was quite a handover of a show. It was quite a celebration of, particularly, I think, 90s, early 2000s, the rap scene and music scene from that time. And it brought to the forefront kind of a conversation around how we're represented in media, because many of us remember how they were represented in media when they were at the height of their careers, at the points and the songs that they were singing at that time. Of course, their careers still go today. That's not the issue. But we remember when they were starting their careers, the kind of backlash, shall I say it like that they were receiving, the kind of anger, hatred, fear, bigotry, racism that was directed towards some of these artists. There was a lack of respect for rap artists in particular. If we talk about Mary J. Blige, then that's a whole level of the intersectionality between Black women and media crossover. But it was quite interesting to bring up what is a topic that we've talked about before, which is how are Black people represented within the media, and what impact does that have around the world? And when we talk about media, I think it's such a broad category that I think we have to kind of name some of the things that are in there. So we're talking film, TV, news, Hollywood, Nollywood. Now we have, like, big places outside of Hollywood that are based, Nollywood, of course, and others. You have advertising, you have print media still plays a part, and you also have social media. And when we look at those, it's fascinating to see how the representations have tweaked slightly, but haven't necessarily changed as much as you think they would have changed. The representation numbers still stay particularly low. So if we're talking historically and we're looking at how has historically media in Western countries portrayed people of color, what you're going to find is that it normally fulfills a stereotypical white supremacist ideology. And so those portrayals of people within media of people of color within white media, it only falls into stereotypes because there's a lack of understanding, and there is just a building upon, let's keep this white stereotypical idea going. And so we can probably hear, if we started naming some of those great people who've made great breakthroughs, we'd be naming people like Sidney Poitier, Denzel Washington. We're talking about in recent times Tyler Perry buying a studio, and also in very recent times someone like Kev on Stage now having a platform through social media and building up his own media empire, but it's a social media based one and is turning into an full entertainment industry, but it's actually built on something quite different, and it's built on a more social media basis, where he's grown a following through grafting away on YouTube and Instagram and all of those different places, and has been able to build a platform outside of those places where he can create content for people of color. Particularly, he concentrates, of course, on Christian content as well. So there's a lot of that happening. So I think it's an interesting to think of that. On the other side of this, we've had in recent years the viral video of Black trauma porn. You know, people watching continuously and over again the deaths, murders, brutalization of Black people, and it going viral, and those videos being really traumatic to watch, but yet still people intensely want to watch them. And the idea, of course, that these murders that people are sending viral by continuing to click and like and go into every time there's a new one released where a Black person is being brutalized, beaten, what have you, these videos actually making mainstream news, even though the images are horrific and violent and real. These are not movies, these are people's real lives, but we're still consuming them. And then I think there's a question of intersectionality between gender and race. Of course, if you have an industry which suffers with Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby and all of these big producers, where there is institutional misogyny at its heart, then how does that intersection of gender and race actually play over for Black women? And particularly when we talk about the colorism debates that we have surrounding the representation of women on screen, you can see that those very narrow definitions of beauty have an effect across all different media groups. So if you go to Bollywood, Nollywood, Hollywood, it doesn't matter. There is this colorism standard that is really infiltrated through the colonial mindset of white supremacy, and really being bought into by their own people, because the representations that they've seen over the years are the same, and they're seeing that played back. So I think there are really interesting questions. And then there are things like, in 1998, we had the film Armageddon. I don't know how many people watched that. And in 1999, we had the film Deep Blue Sea. And in both of those, the protagonist, the main big actor that was in there, the white main big actor, actually ended up dying, and the Black person ended up living. And I remember these as, even for myself, as critical turning points in film. People still talk about the fact that LL Cool J lived, Michael Clark Duncan lived in the film. Like, it was just like so shocking that the Black person would go and live. It was just like, we don't see this. Normally, if there's a Black person in media, that person actually ends up dead within 10 minutes of the film starting. So there's all these little things that happen that give us insights into how the intersectionality is actually working. What's interesting is recently the survey's been done to ask, of course, how people have the stereotype that there are so many more Black people on screen than there've ever been before. Look, there's representation everywhere. However, 2 out of 3 Black people still say that they do not see themselves represented, which means that it's clearly missing the mark with the average person who's living their life, going about their business, doing their daily stuff. They do not feel represented within media. And those representations are still few and far between that hit the average person who wants to just see people like them doing the things that they do in more spectacular ways that, Hollywood can provide. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I probably have loads more to say, but let me pause.
Yeah, look, I'm going to give some statistics and numbers on some of the things that you said throughout this. I mean, to be honest, this is a long conversation.
Yeah.
But perhaps I'd start it with a bit of a word association, perhaps, or memory. Perhaps you might want to reminisce. So I'm just going to give you some names and programs and tell me your response. So, Blackish.
Yeah.
Word association. Or tell me your
Family.
views on it.
Family is my word association with it. Comedy, I guess, is my other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fresh Prince.
Oh, funny. Will Smith. Funny Will Smith. Hilary Banks. That's got to be mine. That's my standout person from the Fresh Prince. That's my word association.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. And just for the record, everyone, Karen Parsons is, like a really nice person in real life.
Yeah, she's amazing.
For the British viewers, I mean, they'll be familiar with Fresh Prince. Maybe some might be familiar with Blackish, but let's try the British audience. Desmond's.
Yes! Yes, man! What are you talking? That's Desmond's. That's my... Do you know what it is? Desmond's is comfort. Isn't that weird? Like, when I think of Desmond's, I think of something really comforting and kind of have a real nostalgia about Desmond's.
Mm-hmm. And for my final one, I think perhaps we need to talk about Cosby. You see what I did there?
Trauma. That's what you did there.
See what I did there? Yeah, Cosby Show.
The Cosby Show. Yeah, it's the idealized Black family. That was the pinnacle of what a Black family looked like and should be. That's what I remember for me, that's when you watch the Cosby Show, you saw a real good Black family. And yeah, there was nothing better than watching that at that time. In hindsight, there's a lot wrong, but never mind. We won't go with hindsight, will we?
There's a lot wrong with the Cosby Show. Not in least the fact that someone was allegedly flaunting their alleged sexual deviances
on screen,
publicly on screen. Yeah. But also what it dealt with was it portrayed an idealistic, it was the ideal Black family, as you say. But what it didn't do was tackle a lot of the political policies, the Reagan era political policies that were being put in place, kind of glossed over all of those things, which is problematic. And I think in many ways it's different to the others that I mentioned, because Fresh Prince tried to tackle some of the hard topics of race and family and things like this, although it did it through humor. Desmond's explored the real life of Black British immigrants, and it did it through the lens of first generation and second generation immigrants and the struggles between the two and the disconnect in beliefs and ideas and all of this. And Blackish explores the modern Black family, middle-class family in the US, and does tackle, as I said, once again, difficult issues which Cosby Show steered away from. So anyway,
just an aside that's quite interesting, because each of those shows that you mentioned are multi-generational.
Yeah.
So, Blackish, it covers all the generations. You have the grandparents, you have the parents, you have the kids, and now I think they have some grandkids and whatever. But, each of those shows, Desmond's included, was multi-generational and reflected in some way the nature of which that Black people actually lived in multi-generational ways. And I think that was a stark contrast to media that was produced by white people for white people. We didn't look like that in those spaces, but in our spaces, that when we were producing media for ourselves, it is a multi-generational media. Sorry, it was just an interesting aside when you were mentioning that.
Yeah. So in US news media, and this is just a few statistics and figures, they're 1.5 times more likely to depict a white family as being socially stable.
Right.
Okay. But they are 1.3 times more likely to depict a black family in association with criminality. So you're less stable,
yeah,
and more likely to be a criminal.
yes.
Right. So there's a a report. It's called a dangerous distortion of our families: representation of families by race in news and opinion media. Right, and this is coming out of the U.S. It also found that media outlets would incorrectly suggest that black men were uninvolved with their families. And we know from previous shows that we've done statistically that's not true. News images would depict them as spending time with their children only 14% of the time. Okay. And I just to give an anecdotal reference, because one of the things that in the past couple of shows we've been trying to emphasize is the way that all of these things or problems manifest themselves across the diaspora.
Yeah.
So take, for example, in the UK, anyone that's coming out of the UK will be familiar with this news story, Mark Duggan.
Oh.
Right? Now let's take the picture of him that was used in the majority of the media on the front pages. And he looked angry. He looked mean. Right? But that picture was deliberately cropped. And when you see the original image, where is it?
Wasn't it at the child's birthday party or something?
No.
And that's not the one you're talking about. Which one was this one?
No. You've just got the location and thing wrong. It was a picture of him at the gravesite of his child.
That's what it is.
Now, which parent is going to look happy?
Yeah.
Right?
Indeed.
And so when you're depicting these things of parents not caring or not being present in their children's life, and then actually when they have the sorrow and are involved in their children's life, you want to use that against them.
Yeah, and depict them as angry. And
right?
I believe, if I remember correctly, the family had released pictures of Mark, but he was with his children, and all of the pictures showed him joyful, and showed him obviously parenting in a positive way. And they were very angry at the representation that was being made over Mark Duggan and the whole situation, but particularly over the photographs, because they had released their own photos and given permission to use the photos of him, but the ones that of course were within the family context
and were positive.
And then of course the news media's pick one where he's grieving and then crop out his grief and turn it into something of anger. And they abuse the image, they abuse his name, they abuse his parent, and it was just awful. The whole story is awful.
Right. But they also portray black families as being welfare recipients 60% of the time, when the actual figure is 42%. Okay, now this 42%, look, that's problematic, but that's for other reasons, right?
Poverty is a real killer.
Right.
And
So
that's a different institutional poverty is a different issue altogether. One we're not covering today, thankfully.
Right. So that's problematic for other issues. The other thing that they do, and actually, as I said, you will hear this in the UK and other English-speaking countries, this phrase of broken homes.
Yeah.
And it's often said, this person comes from a broken home. And that phrase is problematic for the reason that it places the blame for the problems on the family structure.
Yeah.
Right? And it ignores the systemic problems that arise from it. But the broken homes narrative and image actually finds its roots in slavery.
Yeah.
Right.
Indeed.
So what you have is that the broken homes narrative presents a matrilineal structure, right? Strong matriarch, right? And the mother looks after the children. But you have to understand that image stems from the fact that under slavery, young children had to stay with the mother, right? And often children didn't get to spend much time with their fathers under that system, and the family will be broken up and sold. So this whole image, this whole notion of a broken family and everything that it represents actually finds its roots back in slavery. So we're talking about racism creating a problem, causing generational issues, and then you have white people in power turning around and saying, wait there, what about this is your mess, you need to sort it out. No, you created the problem. We might have to sort it out, but you created the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think in terms of the whole family portrayal on TV, I think the irony isn't lost on Black women, particularly that you will have roles like the mammy, where the Black woman is sacrificing her own children to raise white children for the master and blah blah blah, and at the same time you have Jezebel sitting side by side, those two, the asexual mammy figure and the over sexualized Jezebel, each of which is, even in the media portrayal, is being abused by a white master. But what that does then to the family structure that you're then portraying is that the Jezebel, of course, doesn't know the father of her children, but the mammy equally is killing her children. So the idea that even in the portrayal of the Black family as a matriarchal family, that family is also, the matriarchal family is being undermined from the get-go. It's being abused from out the gates. And you have this real destruction of the identity of the humans that live within that system, and that still exists today. Like those stereotypes still have problems today.
And one of the other things that I wanted to raise about the term broken family is that it implies a negative connotation, as though there are structural or there are social problems within that family structure. There are negative connotations that go along with it that need not necessarily be true.
Yeah,
A single
absolutely.
parent can raise a perfectly healthy, functioning family. That is possible. But the term broken family removes all of that and places on that family structure negative connotations. Now, is it the easiest family structure? No. There are arguments that it isn't the best family structure. Accepted. But it doesn't change the fact that it is possible to raise or to create a healthy environment within that family structure. That the term negative, that the term broken family rubs it off.
Yeah, indeed.
Right?
Indeed. I think that people don't realize that words have power. So of course, when you use language to describe a person and you say they're broken, it is that psychological self-fulfilling prophecy. You're actually fueling something within them that can actually have really long-lasting negative effects.
Well, it's funny that you said language is important, because actually one of the other things that the report does is it identifies language that is used. So, for example, it's a language that's used specifically or overwhelmingly in the majority of cases in regards to Black people. So, thug,
Ugh.
right? What that does is it conjures up in most people's minds the image of a dangerous Black male, right?
Sadly.
You have the terms baby mama or baby daddy, right? And
Mm.
especially when used um, by white people or people in positions of power in reference to Black people, it conjures up the idea of promiscuity,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And then you have ghetto, which is racist and classist, right? But once again, all of these terms find their roots and the application of them back in slavery, or at the very least, the Reconstruction era,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But you also have coded language such as working class.
Mhm.
And the term working class, I think, denotes slightly different ideas on both sides of the pond, right? So,
Right. Yeah.
so working class in the US would conjure up the image of suburban white America,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
But if you
No.
say working class to a person from the UK, the image that they get will be one of, well, poor.
Miners and those hard-working communities where they're kind of what we call blue collar workers. These are the people that get their hands dirty.
You're talking about, so you're talking about, when you say working class, you're talking about cleaners, you're talking about miners, you're talking about people that are doing minimum wage jobs,
Yeah.
right? And because you're in the UK, the image that it portrays to most people is one of a white person, but it doesn't exclude other minorities from being within that, right? And
That's
I
true.
think you see this demonstrated by the amount of activity of and the prominent figures of color within the trade union movements,
Mm, mm. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes
right?
sense.
Because
Yeah,
that's not something that you typically see
yeah.
on the other side of the pond. And I know that there are stories of the mafia in terms of trade unions and certain areas of trade unionism, but that's a whole different
That's a different a
discussion.
different topic. That's not what we're talking about.
So, yeah, so
Trade
you have
Europeans in a European trade unions in a European sense, not in a US sense.
right, but the point is that the language used is very important, and I'm going to talk probably more about that later if we have the time to go into that. But there's a paper called oh, what is it called? Representation, Reflection, and Reconstruction of Identity: The Intersection of Black British History and British Television between 1960 to 2015. And here's an interesting tidbit. The author of this paper is Dutch. So,
Interesting.
but I want to read you a quote from the paper, actually.
Okay.
It says, representation in popular culture has a double impact on race relations. It impacts how minority ethnic people see themselves, but also has an impact on how they are perceived by the white population.
Indeed, yeah.
This in turn affects voter behavior and
Mhm.
consequently how individuals and institutions treat ethnic minorities, as well as the often virulent discourse on immigration.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And what she's speaking to there is the importance of factual, accurate,
Mhm,
truthful depictions
mhm.
of minorities in the media and how necessary that is. And that's not just within the news media outlets, that's within TV shows and TV programs, telling the stories of Black families and Black
Mm.
lives.
Mm.
And there's this argument that has often been given that Black stories are not told because they're not profitable.
Mm.
Right?
Mm.
Now, Desmond's that we mentioned earlier actually went against that trend.
Yeah.
Or went against that narrative, not that trend, that narrative.
Yeah.
Because it was a successful TV show running for years. And when you speak to people about it, what they were saying was that people, even out, not just within cities, but people out in rural areas could identify with the story of Desmond's of being outsiders.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea that Black stories are not profitable is clearly not true. Not only that, but correct me if I'm wrong, until Infinity War came out, wasn't Black Panther holding the record for the highest box office
100%.
earnings?
Yes, it was. Yes.
Right?
Until
And that's a Black story.
Yeah.
Right?
That's what we'd say before that.
There was the story, Sony Studios a while ago, emails were leaked in which they were saying that they didn't want to make movies with a Black lead because they wouldn't be profitable. Well, then out comes Equalizer with Denzel Washington. And we see that that's profitable. Black Panther comes out. That's profitable. You know, so it's not that Black stories aren't profitable. It's just that you don't have people within the rooms making decisions.
Well, actually, I wanted to just pause there because I think this idea of profitability, I wish I had the statistic to hand. What they're saying actually is that the McKinsey reports looked at this idea of profitability. They were looking at Black representation from a profitability factor. Is Black representation in media, that narrative being told that it's not profitable and it won't make us any money, seems to actually be contrary to what's actually happening in media.
Absolutely.
And so what they were saying is that per dollar, Black stories are actually more profitable than their white counterparts because they're often notoriously underfunded, lower budgeted, etc., 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 and manage to earn more money per capita than their white counterparts, and therefore the market is profitable. They also noted in the McKinsey study that not only that, but that Black stories have always been profitable, and that is why there is what is it when you steal Black people's work and don't give them credit for it? What's that word I'm looking for?
Cultural appropriation.
Cultural appropriation has been so rife within music, within film and TV, where, and for those of you that don't know, you would have Black artists that would have been singing these songs and getting airplay, but of course artists such as Elvis Presley and so on and so forth, all of that rock and roll generation, would take those songs from the Black artists, not give credit in a lot of cases, and then make profit off of them. And so
Friends and Living Single.
Friends and Living Single. And there's all these stories where actually we're taking what Black people have created and have made profitable for their own community, but we're going to steal it. We're not going to give credit to them. And then we're going to make an even bigger profit off of it by appropriating somebody else's cultural life, etc. So I think that within this idea that Black people's stories aren't profitable, you do see that it's really actually just a straight out lie, because you're appropriating our stories because they are profitable. The stories themselves per capita are more profitable than your story. So even in their original form are more profitable. So what about us isn't profitable? Oh, the fact that we are not allowed to make money off of it. Is that what you're saying? Like, black people aren't allowed to make money off of it, but y'all can. Aha, there's a difference. And I think
Well,
that's where you run into a problem.
but I think also on top of that, I mean, who's the leading box office star right now? Will Smith. Samuel L. Jackson holds one of the records for the most box office, intakes. So we're talking about,
Well,
black actors,
Shondaland is one of the biggest, yeah.
making a lot of money, but or bringing in a lot of money. I think, however, the fact that I can name the male black actors, but would struggle to do the same with the female black actors holding that similar.
Well, Viola Davis has notoriously talked about the fact that even though she is Emmy Award women, Tony Award women, she's got the EGOT, so to speak, she still doesn't get the respect that Meryl Streep gets, or even her black male counterparts gets. She's still fighting to have her name recognized as one of the, she's worth being paid to do her job because she's simply amazing. And the respect that she should get just doesn't come. And she's talked about the disparity that the black women have and the fraternity that they have together, between her and Angela Bassett and other actresses have talked about this huge pay differential between them and their white counterparts, but also them and their black male counterparts, and the recognition aspect.
Well,
so there's a whole thing there with gender.
I was actually going to talk about black boys in British mainstream news media next, but since we're talking about black women in media, it just seems like a natural segue because I do have some facts and figures and statistics on this aspect.
Yeah.
Right. So, in movies, only 1 in 5 black leading ladies from the past decade have a dark skin tone. Okay. Most black leading ladies, 57.1%, have hairstyles that conform to European beauty standards as opposed to natural black hairstyles. Right? The sexualization of black women and women of color stands at 13.5% and 14.8% respectively, that they are more likely to be partially or fully nude than white women. Right? That is who are at 9%. Okay. But this drastically changes when you come to TV, the representation or the sexualization of women when it comes to TV. So the percentage of black women that will be naked, fully or partially on TV, is at 5%. Okay. That figure falls to 2.5% for white women. So we're talking about double the rates for black women, just to demonstrate the sexualization of black women in TV shows.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Right?
Quite disturbing, but really interesting.
Black female characters are more likely to be portrayed as violent. So that's at 29.3% of black female characters versus 24.6% for white women.
The angry black woman trope.
Right? Yes. White female TV characters are more likely to be employed. That is at 89.6% versus 70.5% for black women. Right? Now, once again, you got to think about the stereotypes that these are playing into. So this is the whole idea of the welfare queen.
Yep. And the angry black woman and the
Now, in these jobs that they're employed in, black women are twice as likely to be in a service industry job. That's 56.3% versus 26.4% for white women. So not
Right.
only are you putting out the image that they're unemployed, but when they are employed, it's low paid jobs, right? Black women are less likely to be in a romantic relationship, right? This is 5.6% versus 8.7% for white women. However, bear in mind, okay, they are more likely to be shown having at least one sexual partner. Now, once again, think of the stereotypes that this is buying into. This is the promiscuous Black woman, right? She doesn't have a relationship, but she's sexually active, right? So these are the stereotypes that that are being portrayed. And I think actually, I think it's worthwhile, if you're interested in this subject of the intersectionality of women in the media, checking out the Gina Davis Institute on Gender in the Media.
Yeah, I was reading up on that one earlier.
Right. She does a lot of good work. There's a lot of good work dealing with intersectionality. And I like the fact that she deals with gender, but also gender and race and how they intersect within the media.
Yeah,
Right.
it was a really good report.
I think it's really important, that these things are looked at, because, and I have to give her and the institution credit in this, because it would have been easy just to say, well, we're going to look at the role of gender in this, but actually to then step back and say, no, there's a real disconnect here. We need to look at this. I think they deserve credit for that. So that is based on the US TV news and Hollywood and those statistics. But I think it's worth actually having a discussion on how British media deals with Black women, right? And I think we have a recent example of this, and that's just how they dealt with Meghan Markle versus Kate, right?
Yeah.
But we can also look at how they deal with once again the intersectionality of gender and race. So, for example, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, the interview Diane Abbott did on Sky News, and she got torn apart for it, right? And they described it as a car crash interview, right? Now, Boris Johnson was giving out speeches and interviews,
same day,
right? But he was described as struggling, right? Now, Boris Johnson, when he makes a speech or gives an interview, is incoherent at the best of times. I'm pretty sure him and his toddler child understand each other perfectly.
Pretty sure that they don't. I'm sure the toddler is confused too. But
look, but these are anecdotal.
I mean, the point is well made that I think when it comes to representation of Black women in media in Britain, you do have the stark contrasts, and you do see that within how, let's say, comedians are treated. So, of course, very famously, Gina Yashere has gone off to the States and is doing incredibly well and is building a career, made a show, doing stuff. She's getting recognition for grafting away at her job that she was doing here and wasn't getting the same kind of respect. It was seen as anecdotal, or so this idea that the way that we're talked about, the way that Black women in media are talked about, is actually different, physically different. Like you can just read it, hear it for yourself. It's so different compared to their counterparts in media. You get that with, even down to the way they talk about Moira Stewart is different to the way they talk about the other news anchors. It's like how is that even possible? You can be so disrespectful. But yeah, it's quite obvious. And of course, Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle are the long-running examples of how the media portray two women in the same position, completely differently, doing exactly the same stuff.
Yeah. So that is the unfortunate tale of the depiction of black women in British media. Don't expect to get a fair shot.
No.
So I said, and I think the other thing to note that I think I do want to say on this actually is that it's very hard to find studies and papers and statistics on the representation of black women within the media in Britain.
Yeah.
It is extremely difficult to find papers
It's almost
and
as if
studies.
they're deliberately doing something. It's almost.
It's as though they don't exist.
It's almost as if they're trying to tell you something.
You mentioned Moira Stewart, and I remember, when she first came on air. I'm showing my age now, but I remember when she first came on air, and the British nation, collectively took a gasp and held its breath.
Yeah.
It was like Blazing Saddles. The news anchors are right. So as I said, it's almost as though they've sought to erase black women from the media and its depictions of the media.
And also to note that some of, the recent change in tide, of course, we've mentioned some of these people that are long-standing or that have gone on to have great careers, but there's also quite an interesting one where, of course, the 007 moniker it was time for Daniel Craig to give up the 007 moniker and to have someone else come in and do James Bond. And of course, there is the whole conversation about Idris Elba being the next James Bond, blah, 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 people campaigning for Idris Elba, da, 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 as a black man. What was interesting and still remains, I mean, I feel like going back and watching the film again, just because I found it so startling that they had a black woman playing the 007 moniker and, taking on that mantle, so to speak, and using that denotion for her work. That it's quite interesting that when they do that, when you have such a startling contrast, it was as if people couldn't quite breathe. You kind of audibly heard like people were really struggling to understand. And interestingly, even though that happened, the minute the film was over, everybody asked who the man was going to be to replace Daniel Craig. So even though there was a woman very capably doing it on screen and doing it well, the question was immediately asked at the end of the film, which man is going to take on the mantle of James Bond? And they just blind eye to the fact that, are we not going to have the discussion about the very capable woman that did the thing and how the representation within James Bond, a British kind of movie icon, has changed so drastically from times when women were portrayed as just stereotypical like toys that could be played with by Mr. Bond, to actually having to being more human, all the way through to the 007 moniker being handed over to someone else, and not only just to someone else but to a black woman. I think that conversation and that narrative surrounding James Bond probably deserves a whole Darkside in and of itself, to be fair, but I think it's quite interesting because it really does tell a story of how media has changed. Because you think about Eartha Kitt back in the day and you're looking at 007 today and you're like, whoa, we've come an awful long way, and yet still the narrative, like, even though that representation has changed, we haven't come anywhere, because the minute it was over, everybody went, okay, so Idris Elba? No, anyone? And it was just like, did you not understand? Did you not see the same thing we were seeing? But it's so, the ingrained images that we have through generational kind of ingrained media portrayals of Black people are so deeply ingrained in us that we find it difficult to engage in those topics in that way.
Yeah, look, listen, I echo those sentiments. The fact that you had a Black woman portraying the
What's an
spy,
EBT
the
card?
007 moniker so well. What was that? Sorry.
What's an EBT card?
That's like a card you use to get like welfare, like food stamps,
Oh,
that sort of stuff.
okay.
Yeah, look, as I said, look, there's a lot of trolls out tonight. Yeah,
I'd never heard that term before. I'm not from the States, so I don't know that term.
Yeah, so look, I see that we are over time.
Yes.
I don't know if we have time to go into statistics of Black men and representation in the UK.
Well, I think we are over time. It's something that we come back to as a particular topic if you want. So it's up to you. Do you want to do it? Is it going to take a couple more minutes? Then we can do it. If you really want. I wouldn't
Couple
like
more
them
minutes.
I
Couple more
wouldn't like
minutes.
them to be left out. I wouldn't want anyone to think
Couple more minutes, yeah?
leaving Black
Okay,
men out of
couple
the
more
picture.
minutes. Yeah. Just a few more minutes. Right. So, portrayal of young Black men and boys in UK media. There's a report that was commissioned by the Labour government in 2000, and it was released in 2011. And it's entitled Media Representation of Young Black Men and Boys. So, these are some of the statistics and findings of the report. In mainstream news, young men and boys, so this is of all races, were regularly reported on negatively.
Right.
Okay. So, and of this negative reporting, 4 out of every 10 stories were crime related.
Surprise, surprise.
Right. But this is for all races.
Right.
That number rises to 7 in 10 when dealing with young Black men and boys.
I'm surprised that there are, I don't mean this rudely, but having obviously grown up, lived within the British media system in the British country, I'm surprised it's as high as 3 in 10 that aren't crime-related stories, to be honest.
Well, no, you have to bear in mind that's actually quite plausible because of the large role that football plays over there.
Oh, right.
The overwhelming
yes, that's where they get the
representation.
3 from.
Right.
Yes, because I was like,
I'm being facetious. I'm being facetious in that response, but actually a large number of them probably are attributed to sports stories.
No, but I mean, I say that because, growing up, a lot of the stories you see, even to this day, if someone comes on the news and there is a criminal, we all do the collective hold your breath. Oh, please don't let it be a Black person. And of course, whenever it is, there's not another counter story out there to do something else. The majority of people being interviewed, the majority of people being covered in other stories are white people. So I literally was struggling to figure out how somebody managed to count that there were 3 good stories about Black people, not because there aren't things that Black people are doing that aren't good, but because the media just doesn't cover it. But when you said football, I went, aha, now I like, not in a bad way, but it's like the media is skewed 7 in 10. Obviously, it's skewed to give you the negative criminal stories, but it really is in Britain overwhelmingly loudly negative against Black men.
Right. Well, the report actually is quite interesting. I don't look, just allowing for the dark side, there isn't enough time to go through everything that it says and pick it apart and examine it. But it is interesting because it does actually break down these stories into different categories, and it shows the representation of the group as a whole, young boys and men as a whole, and then depicts it when it's solely against young Black men and boys, and the discrepancies and where the categories rank first, second, third, and it all changes. So it's actually a very interesting report in that regards. So anyway, the report goes on to say that in current affairs documentaries, so young Black men and boys were more often than not depicted in association with crime, especially violent crime. So knife crime, gun crime, gangs. And what it also went on to say is that although there was some attempt to look at how systemic issues may have shaped their experiences, it wasn't much, especially when compared to how news outlets, media outlets that were from a Black or ethnic perspective spoke of the story.
Yeah.
Where they would speak, actually, no, the real issues going on here. And one of the things that they spoke of is that they gave examples of a crime, of actual real crime. And what they said was that just the whole reporting of how things are reported is problematic because it presents a them and us, but it does it in terms of race.
Yeah.
And how it does this is by emphasizing the race of the perpetrator. Okay. So you do a crime, Black suspect does a crime, right? So it others the Black person as being different. You're not part of us.
Yeah.
Right? But what it does by not mentioning any other race is that it centers the normative on being white.
Yes.
Okay. So Richard Dyer in his work, White Essays on Race and Culture, he has as a central argument the fact that white people don't see themselves as white. It's everyone else that is racialized, right? And they then present themselves as the norm. So everything is then measured against them being the standard.
Yep.
Right? And so what this means is that everything that isn't white is a deviation.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at these stories and that they emphasize race and the other Blackness, that the Black that's bad, or what's good.
Yeah. But then, this we could talk about in terms of, for people that are struggling to understand this concept, I would say if you're European, particularly, so if you come from one of the European countries, just think about how, and we spoke about this, we mentioned this, how footballers are described. When a footballer does something bad, or when a Black person does something bad in media, they are described as of blah, blah, blah heritage, right? As soon as they win gold or make the football, score a goal or do whatever, it is British person, or French person, they completely eradicates. Suddenly, we mysteriously can become the thing that we are not held accountable to. And you see that very clearly. You can just go through a newspaper and go through a set of news stories about sports associations, and you will see when people are doing things negatively. And this happened, was it the World Cup or the Europeans last year, around the young guys who missed the penalties in the World Cup final? Up until then, British team doing well. And as soon as a mistake was made, every racial name they could find, that the people of Jamaican heritage, blah, 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 born from parents who were immigrants, all of a sudden they were described as everything else but British. Well, for weeks, they were the British team. And as soon as they made a mistake, then they were held up to a different standard and account and were ostracized from that idea of Britishness or whatever.
Just use the example that you gave of footballers. I think just to speak on that, Romelu Lukaku. actually spoke
Mm,
on this.
mm,
And what he said was that when he does something well and performs well, he's Belgian,
yeah. Yeah.
right? But the moment he has a poor game, he's a Congolese
Yep. Yep.
Belgian.
Yes.
They
Indeed.
automatically other him from
Yeah.
being Belgian,
Yep.
right?
They add extra
So,
words.
so you have footballers themselves speaking on this matter.
Yeah.
Okay. So, um, during the period of this report, they monitored the British media. Okay. And what they said was that for most of the crimes, there was no reason given.
Yeah.
Okay. But on the numbers that they did, or the times that they did, I'm going to give you the statistics
Mm-hmm.
for the reasons given.
Okay.
Right? And you're going to see a theme linked to this on subjects that we mentioned earlier. So, the highest reason is social deprivation,
Poverty.
right? That ranks at 21.4%.
Okay.
In tied second place, we actually have a couple of statistics. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 reasons. And they
Okay.
all come in at 14.3% each. Do you want to
Okay.
have a guess at any of them?
No, let's just tell me.
Okay. Lack of a father figure,
Oh Lord.
poor
Okay.
parenting,
Oh Lord.
drug or alcohol use,
Oh Father, help me.
anger or revenge, gang rivalry. And then at 7.1%, you have educational underachievement.
Oh Jesus. I just like there's like every stereotype that doesn't fit any. Oh, it's just Lord help me. Anyway.
Right? So these are all stereotypes that we've spoken to and mentioned earlier in this program that are being given as the reasons for this.
As given as the reasons for what now? Because
For,
even
for criminality.
oh
So when they write the stories on crime, they're saying that when they mention, in the few instances where they mention reasons for the crime, these are
these
the
are the
reasons that
reasons.
they're given,
The reasons, yeah, of course. These are the reasons.
right? No
Indeed.
father figure.
Mhm, mhm.
Listen, I'm like, you know how many people grow up in homes without a father and never commit a crime?
Oh, hello, somebody. Hello. What has that got to do with the price of bread? Do you know, I do find sometimes when we talk about media representations, and we've done it once before as relates to a very specific incident, you actually, if you really stop and start to assess the media that you have been consuming and the stereotypes that you have been facing, and then look at the ideas that you have about yourself and others around you, you may find yourself feeling really odd and feeling really at odds with what you're experiencing, because so much of this becomes internalized dialogue. So much of this, not only, as you said earlier, affects the people who are the majority in that country, majority culture in that country, but the minority culture in the country, the world majority culture, but the minority in that country, those people start to internalize these discussions about themselves. They start to actually, it affects their own identity. And so when you see how stark those figures are, it's just not
Right.
nice.
So, and actually, it's quite interesting because the paper that I mentioned earlier by the Dutch young lady,
Mm-hmm.
what she does actually is she looks at British media and then compares it to Dutch media and talks about the parallels and the issues and the similarities between it, but also the differences. And there are some quite interesting differences that she speaks on.
Wow, there's some
But
nuance in the Netherlands that bears talking about from time to time, I think.
right. So the report concludes that there was a lack of social context in the coverage, which I've mentioned, right?
Mhm.
Uh, but I want to give you a quote from it. And what it says is that it was not a priority within crime stories to seek to understand crimes involving Black young men and boys more specifically.
No one is surprised by that.
Right.
You're just a stereotype to them. You're not. You're just a criminal. There is no story behind that.
No.
You know, this is why, you know, when Ava DuVernay does the Exonerated 5 story, you know, people are left reeling because no one sought to understand. Not only is the whole story horrific and they didn't do it and it's all awful, but also these are real humans. You're destroying actual humans' lives. But because you're a criminal, you don't get the privilege to be human. And especially, you know, that being true for people of color, you know, you are just reduced to the stereotype. And if we look, you know, so we're talking about Black representation, but if we look at Hispanic representation in, you know, media, it's the same. If you look at Arab representation within media, if you look at, so all these different groups are reduced to very simple stereotypes where the humanity, there's no reasoning given. But we have, you know, very in-depth shows at the moment that are quite big, which explain in great detail the misdeeds of like the Wolf of Wall Street. And, you know, why would they do such a thing? Let's unpack their childhood. Let's look at how that, why don't they just get the privilege of being a criminal like the rest of us? No? Oh, shocking that you're interested in that and no one else is.
So this report goes on to identify 5 labels that are used for reference to young Black men and boys.
Oh, no.
You want to have a guess at any of the labels?
Criminal? Lazy?
Not quite. What was that?
Lazy?
No.
Uneducated? These are not. Oh, wow. What is going to come up on this list?
Oh, it's worse than that.
Okay, go on.
So
I'll just write them down.
The 5 labels that were used, that they identified, and they would, more than one of these labels could be used within a story.
Okay.
Gang, that ranks at 62% of the stories this is used in. Youths, 27%. Thugs, 6.6%. Hoodies, 3.6%. And yobs at 0.7%.
Yeah, because yobs are not really, it's not a Black thing, is it? That's really scary. That's really, really scary because you could have basically summed that all up in one word: criminal.
Yeah.
It's just 5 different ways of saying criminal.
Criminal or threat, danger.
Violent.
Yeah.
There's 5 different ways of saying violent, criminal, angry, you know, I mean, that's quite disturbing. It's quite disturbing.
Right. So I'm going to give you another quote from this report.
And then we're going to wrap it up.
Yep. From our examination of the news content, as well as our interviews with journalists, it would seem that an image associating Black young men and boys with gun and knife crime does clearly exist within the news media, and that stories articulating this image appear to be high on the news agenda. So what they're stating here is that there's actually an agenda to promote these negative stories, these negative labels, and these negative images of young Black men within the media.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. An agenda is something that you do consciously. This is not an unconscious action.
Right. The idea of unconscious bias not at play here.
Right. So
there's intentionality.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, you know, through our discussion, obviously it's really informative, very educational, quite heavy topic for people that are joining us, watching with us, and unpacking some of this stuff themselves. But I hope that when people walk away from this discussion, what they realize is that simple word, there is an intention to portray Black and world majority cultures in mainstream European Western media in detrimental ways to your own identity. It's there deliberately. It's not by accident. Nobody happened upon it by accident. And while accidents are made by individuals, of course, because I as an individual can say something that offends you and not intend it in that way, actually there is a cultural work at play that is systemic. And I think for those of you that follow kind of Trevor Noah or India Arie, you will have seen the Trevor Noah India Arie interview this week, where he says, I don't believe that Josh Rogan is your mortal enemy. And she says, no, but what is my mortal enemy is systemic injustice against Black people and Black women. And that is, you can have an individual within the system who's making poor choices, Rogan, but what he is a symptom of is a wider institutional problem. You and I in this argument we'll find a way to make it through, and we can find common ground and we can find healing. But there is a deliberate attempt to maintain a system of oppression in media. Like, it's not by accident that when you're listening to a story, you're holding your breath because you're hoping that the person's race or color is not going to be mentioned. It's not by accident that when you're watching, stories, that they're going to use 5 different terms to describe young Black boys as violent criminals. That's not by accident. There is an intention, and the papers that do get released, the research that does get released, that we can get a hold of, bears that out. And I hope that you walk away from this going, I need to really assess, what am I putting in and what am I believing about myself? And how is that affecting my interaction with my own culture, with your own people, with people of opposite cultures, with people in other parts of the world? It is so vastly different, the actual reality versus what is being put out in media. Do you have a wrap-up point that you hope that people will take away from this?
Mainstream media doesn't always tell you the truth, but it doesn't always lie either.
Oh, why? Because it's being intentional about who it is, not about you.
No, it's because I'm not one of these MAGA idiots that believe, that nothing you see is real or true.
Well, there is that. I think there is that. There is that. No.
That's it.
Oh dear. But sadly, and this, since you brought that up, I just would like to add as a kind of a caveat or a PS or whatever you'd like to say on the end, which is, what I find frustrating about that sort of thing is that you can have conspiracies to believe that somebody is conspiring to produce an image of blah, 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 so that we can all be masked up because they've got some evil intention and blah, 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 which of course is what you want to believe, but you can't believe the thing staring you in your face. You somehow find it impossible to believe that if you hear enough stories about Black criminality, that you would think that Black people are criminals. Like, you can't just make that 2 + 2 jump, but somehow you can make a 2 + 2 and end up at 24. But you can't make 2 + 2 and it equal 4. Like, somehow you're not able to do that. And I find that irritating about conspiracies. But anyway, that was just my aside. Just my little aside. I got it off my chest. I feel better now.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for joining the dark side. We have run over like 3 weeks in a row. We're going to need to get this down somehow. I thought we were doing better because we condensed the news half, and now no, we're still over time. Now, if you would like to have us do a particular subject, or there's something you're interested in knowing, please do comment in the comment section and we will try and pick that up. We thank you for joining us and watching this back in your own time. Of course, if you watch this at another time than when we produce it live, we thank you for joining us this evening. We wish you all the best. Stay safe out there if you're in a European country and there's a storm passing over your head. As I think we've got, was it Douglas heading over our head right now? I can't remember which storm. Stay safe, be well, as a friend of mine would say, and peace. Something you'd like to say goodbye to the lovely people?
No, I'm good.
Well, you could just say bye. That is entirely
bye.
possible. All right, we'll see you next week on the Dark Side, 9 o'clock Central European time. All the best. Night.